So, Siri, what does this award mean to you?
Well, prizes, drop from the sky. And my father once said something about the Lutheran notion of grace. And he said, grace is something that you don't deserve and you didn't necessarily earn, but the correct response to grace is gratitude. So I would say this is a kind of small, more human form of grace, and that is generally my response. One of gratitude, surprise, and happiness. That's about it.
Hi, this is Carlos Cristina from the Spanish newspaper Oviedo. I was lucky to meet you many years ago when I interviewed Paul in New York. I want to ask you, have you talked to him? How do you feel? I mean, the fact that the 30 years apart, both of you receive the same prize with different names, but the same honor.
I called him when I was absolutely sure that he would be awake. That I wasn't going to wake him up. And he was very happy. I feel that there's something kind of wonderful about the fact that there are two people in the same family. And I guess that's it. I just, we're both pleased. I was pleased then. It was a pleasure to see him actually get that prize. And I know for certain that he feels the same way. Thank you.
One of the things that the jury has said about your work is a feminist perspective, among many other things. I wonder what you think of the new feminist surge, the new generation surge of feminism that particularly in Spain has arisen in the last years.
It's probably difficult for me to address a specific Spanish incarnation of what some people are calling the fourth wave of feminism. Depends on how you're counting, where you're going. Feminism is something that over the centuries, actually, if you want to go way back, you can go back to the text written by Christine de Pizan, right, in the 1400s against misogyny. So the waves of feminism keep reappearing. I think they sometimes reappear in connection to backlash, which we're seeing in nativist populism, which is certainly deeply present in the United States, also present in Spain, as we've seen from the last election, in Germany and in Eastern Europe. And so I think we need feminism. We need feminism because the story is not over, and also because feminism is very profoundly, at least for me, a form of humanism. It is a way of thinking about the liberation of human beings from the constraints of gender. It's rather simple. And I think that women, people who do not identify as either women or men, people of all genders, are liberated by the ideas of feminism.
More questions?
There must be another question. What, sorry? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all,
You and I can just talk, and that's it.
I want to congratulate you before, and just to ask you, what were you doing this afternoon in London, and just talk to us about your admiration for Charles Dickens. Who was one of your first passions?
That's right. So I'm promoting Memories of the Future, my most recent novel here in London and Manchester, Bath, and the Hay Festival. Okay, Charles Dickens, great subject. I wrote my doctoral dissertation, my PhD on Dickens, but my love for Dickens goes much further back than that. I first read David Copperfield when I was 13, and it was that novel that made me want to write novels. So Dickens has a deep place in my life. Even further back, my Norwegian grandmother, my mother's mother, read Charles Dickens in Norwegian over and over again. He was her most beloved author. So you see there's actually a generational continuation of Dickens lovers in my family. This new novel has a number of references to Dickens. Some are rather open and some are far more hidden. So I never forget the person that I gave when I was writing my dissertation. I used to refer to him as Dear Charles.
What is your favorite Dickens book?
My favorite Dickens book is one that actually many people don't read as much as others, and that is his last finished novel, Our Mutual Friend, which I think is a masterpiece. And a deeply, I don't know if Dickens thought that he was writing philosophy, but I think it's a deeply philosophical book about the nature of the self, especially the self in connection to language. And had I known more about neurology at the time, which I knew a little bit about, but not as much as I do now, I would have written more comprehensively about his knowledge of the science of the time, and also his profound insights into medicine and neurological problems that I think Dickens is just brilliant. He was a great observer of human beings and illness. Yeah. Oh, no.
Oh,
Someone
no.
didn't? No?
Rafa first, and then you go on.
Okay.
Regarding Dickens, it doesn't seem that nowadays novels that Dickens proliferate, and it doesn't seem that the right way now to the classical world, the expensive novels. Do you feel more comfortable right now writing essays or novels? And another question that will also like you to comment. What do you think about social networks? Are you familiar with them? Do you think they've changed?
Right. Okay. The modern novel, by which I mean the novel that was generated by Cervantes, right? Okay. That novel, not the Greek novel. There are many debates about when the novel begins, what it is, blah, blah, blah. But let's just say the modern novel. Let's start it with Cervantes, who, in a way, explored all the possibilities of the novel before the modern novel had even generated itself. This is the fascinating thing about Don Quixote, right? Wow, how did he do all that before there was a tradition to do it? But every era has its forms. I suspect that some of the long story forms that are evolving now are often on television, right? The Netflix. I'm a little behind the times. I don't have social media. I don't know if I should say this, but there is an Instagram account, but no, I mean, I'm not directly responsible, let's put it that way. And so I think that there are written forms. The novel too one hopes that it keeps making itself. Long prose fiction is not going to go away. It is not disappearing. But they come out of a particular climate, both political and social. Culture is not something outside us, it's also something inside us. So the fact that Dickens and Thackeray and various other 19th century novels are not being written today is probably something we shouldn't mourn, because we're living in another time. Nevertheless, in this novel, I'm having a lot of fun with those older novels in the 18th and 19th century, including illustrations that I made for this book, because when I was growing up, I loved reading 19th century novels, and I particularly love those little illustrations with the caption underneath. You know, so my pleasure in reading those old books is in part reflected in this novel that I wrote, with a lot of references to 18th century English.
Yeah, actually my question was regarding the novel that brought you to London, Memories of the Future. And if you could tell us a bit more without any spoilers for people that haven't
Right.
read it yet.
Sign of the times.
So it's a book about time, which is an ineffable thing. You know, I do not have the quote by Augustine, Saint Augustine, the famous quote, is not in the book because I'm a little tired of reading it. But you know what it is? It is this. I know what time is, but if someone asks me to explain it, I can't tell you. I think we all feel that about time. It's a very strange human experience. So this book is about an older narrator who discovers a notebook that she kept when she was 23, the first year she moved to New York. And it's in a way a dialogue between selves. The older self glossing, recontextualizing the experiences of the younger self. While I was writing the book, I laughed a lot. I find it to be essentially a kind of comic novel, even though there are very serious and some sad things in it. But the tone is overall one of buoyancy, which reflects the references to both Dickens and to that Tristram Shandy, one of the most original texts, probably, in the novel form. But you were going to say something, yes.
So, when I refer to the fact that all won this award, many people has referred to him before as the life of this. Do you think that with this award, maybe the people will start avoiding this fact?
Yeah, you know, I kind of hope so. You know, it's because this is not personal. This is something I understand. This is actually about men and women and sexism. That the continual idea that a woman's identity is formed and linked to a man in ways that a man's is not in the culture. And so, for someone like me, recognition in various forms helps to defeat that. But it doesn't mean that the problem vanishes, right? Even if it vanishes for me, it doesn't vanish for other women working in those contexts. And fascinating, you know, you think about a very famous couple like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir wrote original philosophy that was attributed to self during her lifetime. Just give you a little thing. She knew German. Sartre did not read German. All the Hegelian references had to go through Simone de Beauvoir. This was not recognized for years and years and years. That's a little indication of how things can go dreadfully wrong. Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, another famous couple, both great painters. Krasner's influence on Pollock is just now being recognized. Everyone kind of knew. She was doing all of her paintings before Pollock ever touched it. Now, I was in Bilbao, this is a couple of years ago, they had an abstract expressionist show, and there was Krasner's canvas hanging opposite of Pollock. And Hers, of course, is earlier. You can see the direct influence that she had on him, but that was buried. This is the tendency in the culture, right? And it goes way back. Certain women artists were very famous in their lifetimes. Artemisia Gentileschi, famous for a painter, famous in her time. Her father was a painter. After she died, for hundreds of years, her best canvases that were signed by her were attributed to her father. Her signature. There it is. Nope, they didn't believe it. They were too good. Right? So this is what we're fighting. It's not a personal story. It's not about my particular marriage that, you know, has been a marriage of equals from the very beginning, right? Between us. It's about perception. It's how works by women are denigrated and works by men are elevated, and how the culture has to combat that. You know, perception is part of our value system. And the more we're able to strip ourselves of those biased predispositions, which we all have, by the way. Men, women, all of us. We are not free of the patterns of our own culture. The only way to change that is to look hard at works of art and to be exquisitely conscious of our own biases.
So thinking about the future, do you think that, and you could hope that this way will change in the future? This situation is.
You know, so I always have two ways to look at a problem. So one way is to say that in the United States, anyway, women have not yet had suffrage, the right to vote, for 100 years. So what year was it in Spain? So it's the 30s. So it's late. It's not as late as France, 1944. Not as late as one canton in Switzerland, 1974, I believe, or 3. So in that sense, you can say a lot has happened in the last 100 years. When I was a little girl growing up, there were no doctors and lawyers who were women in my little town in Minnesota. Zero. I never saw a woman taking care of patients in my childhood. Now, half the doctors, I have a job. I'm in the psychiatry department at Weill Cornell Medical College, where I teach a seminar to psychiatric residents. Half of the psychiatrists, maybe not quite half, but close to half of the psychiatrists in training are women now. So that's changed. At the same time, as soon as women get into a profession, its status goes down. That has not changed. Right? So, the other way is that, you just have to keep making the point. You can't let it go. Yes.
We need to work hard every single day to explain to our readers the madness of Brexit. How would you explain the madness of Trump to the rest of the world?
Well,
do you have any justification?
I have not hidden my views about the person I refer to as the current occupant of the White House. I think he's can be clinically diagnosed with a personality disorder. He's a psychopath. And that is something that, in a way, is neither here nor there, because the big problem is not that such people exist. The big problem is that many millions of people voted for him. Right? So what does that say about the culture that I live in? I think that for a lot of people, Trump was a vehicle, a fantasy vehicle, from shame to pride. And by that, I mean that large numbers of people, particularly white men without college education, but also white women without college education, 62% of white women, 68% of white men without college education, something like 52% of all white women across the board. You know, we're talking about whiteness here. And we're talking about a sense of whiteness that never had to be internalized, that you were white, right? It's like being a man. It's the universal, what Simone de Beauvoir wrote. Whiteness was the norm. Everything else was other. But whiteness granted you a position in the culture that didn't have to be questioned. The demographic changes in the United States have changed all that, which is why we have an idea of white identity now for some of these people. It is not that whiteness does not give you privilege in the United States, it does, right? But that privilege is being questioned and the country is changing. Resistance to that change manifests itself in a kind of shame, right? Those fancy people on the coasts, those uppity women and uppity black people who are looking down at us white guys out there in middle America. I mean, I grew up there, so I know what I'm talking about. And Trump comes along and he's thumbing his nose at all of that. He's openly racist. He's openly a misogynist. And when people say, I love Trump because he's honest, he speaks his mind, they're talking about lifting certain taboos that they began to feel were part of the culture. And because he does it, and he was perceived as this huge, rich guy, it gives a frisson, something that makes happiness, makes even joy, and gives them back what they feel had been taken away, which is pride. That's pretty deep. This is my reading, of course. You don't read it in the newspaper. This is my particular take on it.
Any more questions?
Yes?
You know, Trump is visiting London in 2 weeks. What are the risks of many Trumps that are now here?
Well, yes. I mean, part of this is a kind of contagion, which is something that's very interesting to look at, right? So Trump has emboldened other nativist populist leaders. They borrow his language, they borrow his swagger, and as, what is that platitude that's endlessly repeated in the United States? The leader of the free world. And he, of course, has more power simply because he is the President of the United States. And I think it's very dangerous. Is there a silver lining? I think we should be grateful that he's also ignorant, totally uneducated, knows nothing about the Constitution, about the law, etc. Because if we had a more Machiavellian person who disguised himself more, we might be even in greater trouble. So I don't know if his stupidity will save us in 2020, but I think it's a small thing to be grateful for.
Maybe a last question? Anyone? Otherwise, I'll ask myself.
Okay.
Good. Well, to end up on a happier note,
Yes.
when you attended the ceremony in Oviedo, did you
I was there
already,
before.
Yeah.
So you bet. I thought it was great, you know, from the other side. I was up in the balcony, and my dog, we were getting a little teary.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and now we have some engagements with press as well, so journalists can refer to Rita, who is press officer today, so she will organize us all. Thank you all very much for coming.